Markets were in turmoil again this Monday as the world continues to wrestle with the impact of Donald Trump's tariffs on global trade. Here in Europe, Germany's DAX plunged 10% on opening before finishing the day more than 4% in the red, and there were similar losses in France and the UK. Against the backdrop of crashing stock markets and economic uncertainty, EU trade ministers gathered in Luxembourg to discuss their response to Washington's new trade regime. Starting on Wednesday, the EU will face tariffs of 20% on almost all exports to the United States. Now, Donald Trump's levies are causing anxiety and anger in European capitals. The transatlantic trade relationship is the biggest in the world, worth €1.5 trillion. European officials say they would rather talk than fight the U.S. on tariffs. But if push comes to shove, all options are on the table.
So it's very clear that we are open for negotiations, and that in parallel we are preparing a potential list for retaliation and other measures for retaliation if this is necessary. We prefer to have a negotiated solution.
Right now we are in the early stages of discussions because the US views tariffs not as a tactical step but as a corrective measure. We are fully prepared to sit at the negotiation table whenever our American partners are ready. While the EU remains open to and strongly prefers negotiations, we will not wait endlessly.
But how to get those discussions started? To move things along, the EU is offering what it called a 0 tariff deal for cars and other industrial products. So far, Washington hasn't responded. Another call for transatlantic free trade went even further, and it came from Donald Trump's inner circle. Here's Elon Musk.
I'm hopeful, for example, with the tariffs, that at the end of the day, I hope it is agreed that both Europe and the United States should move, ideally, in my view, to a zero tariff situation, effectively creating a free trade zone between Europe and North America.
Now, the irony of that remark, especially coming from where it came from, wasn't lost here in Europe. France's trade minister agreed it was a great idea, and Germany's outgoing vice chancellor had this message for the Tesla CEO.
I read what Elon Musk said. I think it's a sign of weakness and maybe of fear, because the acting politics are completely different. So if he has something to say, he should go to his president and say, before we're talking about zero tariffs, let's stop the nonsense the mess you have just made in the last week.
Terry Schultz has been following developments from Brussels. Terry, the EU's trade commissioner talked about a paradigm shift today in global trade. Does that reflect the mood in Brussels, that there really is no going back from here?
I think what Maros Šefčovič meant was that there will be lasting changes from what Donald Trump has done, no matter how this current tariff war works out. It will change how the EU does business, with whom it does business. And the bottom line is that there's simply no more taking the transatlantic relationship, which was the largest trade relationship in the world, for granted, Nicole.
The EU says it's preparing countermeasures, keeping all options on the table. What are the most likely options, though?
Well, they definitely preface everything by saying they would rather negotiate than retaliate. But at the same time, we know that the EU is planning to put into motion a series of counter tariffs starting on April 15th. The list of items to be targeted is being finalized right now, literally today and over the next couple of days. And it's expected to include everything from, dental floss to vacuum cleaners to meat. But one thing, Nicole, we're hearing tonight that will not be on that list is American bourbon. Now, this was a very controversial issue because President Trump said if that's on the list, he would immediately impose a 200% tariff on all alcohol coming from the EU. So you can imagine, if that's truly off the list, that France is breathing a sigh of relief. Now, there's another tool that they have in their arsenal, and that's referred to as the Big Bazooka. Now, its real name is the anti-coercion instrument, so you can see why they don't use that so often. But this would allow the EU to target U.S. services, banking, tech companies, and that is a very touchy issue.
Let's take a closer look at this. The anti-coercion instrument, really a mouthful. Is this broadly seen as a last resort. Is everyone in the EU on the same page about using or not using these options?
They're not on the same page about this because in addition to being called the big bazooka, it's also called the nuclear option. And that shows you just how seriously it's taken, how this is only something you use if you're absolutely pushed into a corner. France and Germany are in favor of, if not using this, at least making the U.S. believe they would use it as a deterrent. But there are countries like Ireland, which is highly dependent on business from U.S. services, that is absolutely desperate to avoid using that. Again, the EU constantly says it would rather talk than fight. But this is certainly considered one of the biggest weapons, I guess you could call it, in its arsenal.
So the EU doesn't want a trade war. They do want a deal. Does it seem to you like President Donald Trump is interested in that?
Well, I was just listening to President Trump speaking in the Oval Office alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and it didn't sound that way at all. He was asked a couple of times if he was willing to negotiate on EU tariffs, and instead he doubled down on his now, well-worn criticism of the EU, that it treats the U.S. badly. He, of course, went on to speak about cars, saying that the EU doesn't let American cars be imported, and he, in fact, said now that it's not just about tariffs. He said there are other barriers that he wants to clear up. So that sounded the opposite of wanting to make a deal.
So amid all this chaos, has mending fences with China maybe gained new importance for Europe?
I think this is something that the EU is looking at, but there are problems in the EU-China trade relationship that don't have anything to do with simply, possibly declining trade with the United States. However, Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, does say regularly that the EU must look for new partners. Now, it's not just China. They are also talking to India, to South America, South Korea, South Africa. There's a theme here for other large markets, perhaps countries that they don't have so many trade rifts as they do with China right now. But, if we come back to your first question about a paradigm shift, this just shows that the EU is well aware that there is likely to be lasting damage from the tariff war, and that no matter what happens between the U.S. and the EU, it does need to expand its horizon on trade.
DW's Terry Schultz. Thank you so much, Terry. Great speaking to you.